my husband brought his mistress into the home I built, claiming she was disabled and needed my, quote, charity. While he spent our retirement fund on her secret offshore accounts, he laughed at my, quote, boring auditing job. He wanted a maid who wouldn't ask questions. He thought he was playing a game of pity, but I've been tracing every cent of his betrayal since the minute they arrived. I'm about to show him exactly what a soulless woman can do to a man who steals her legacy. Let me tell you how it all began. I stood in the kitchen of our California ranch-style home, looking out toward the flickering lights of the hills, holding a glass of iced tea. That afternoon, I had done something most people my age only dream of. I had made the final payment on our mortgage. Every cent of that 3,000 square foot sanctuary now belonged to me, paid for by my 1 decade as a compliance director. It was the physical manifestation of my own American dream. I was 38, but I felt the weight of a legacy I was building for my future self. I remember thinking, for just one blissful moment, that I had finally secured our peace. Then, I heard the heavy thud of the front door, followed by a sound that didn't belong in my house, the rhythmic, mechanical squeak of wheels on hardwood. Richard didn't call. He didn't text. He simply marched into the foyer, his face flushed with that high-octane arrogance he wore like a designer suit. Behind him, he was pushing a wheelchair. In it sat a woman who looked like a ghost from a past I had tried to forget. Evelyn Chavez. She was Richard's college muse, the aspiring actress who had broken his heart a decade before I met him. Now, she looked frail, wrapped in a pashmina that cost more than a month's worth of groceries, her legs covered by a heavy wool blanket despite the warm California breeze. Richard didn't greet me. He didn't look at the bottle of champagne I had set out to celebrate our mortgage-free life. He just stopped in the center of the living room, gestured to the woman in the chair, and looked at me with a mixture of defiance and pity that made my skin crawl. He told me that Evelyn had been in a horrific accident, that she was paralyzed from the waist down, and that she had no one else in the world. He called it fate. He called her his lost destiny. And then, with a straight face, he told me that she would be moving into our guest suite indefinitely because it was the morally right thing to do. The air in the room felt thin. I looked at Evelyn, and for a split second, the damsel in distress mask slipped. I saw it, a sharp, calculating glint in her eyes as she surveyed my crystal vases and my original artwork. She wasn't looking for a place to heal. She was scouting a conquest. Richard stepped closer to me, his voice dropping into that condescending tone he used when he thought I was being difficult. He told me that my job as an auditor had turned my heart into a calculator. He said I was dry, soulless, and obsessed with rules, while Evelyn was a creature of pure emotion and tragedy. He actually had the audacity to suggest that caring for her would be good for me, that it would soften my edges. He told me to use my boring free time to be her hands and feet, claiming I owed him this much after all the sacrifices he had made for our lifestyle. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. He wanted a live-in maid for his mistress, and he wanted me to pay for the privilege with my dignity. I felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury, but I didn't scream. In my world, the one who screams is the one who loses. I looked at the mortgage papers on the counter, then back at my husband, a man who was currently high on his own supply of self-righteousness, unaware that I had already seen the confidential alerts on our joint investment accounts. He thought I was a paper pusher. He forgot that a compliance director's entire life is built on finding the one lie that topples the whole tower. I took a slow breath, my fingers brushing the sleek silver casing of the digital recorder disguised as a high-end fountain pen in my pocket. I had bought it a week ago when I first noticed the missing thousands from our retirement fund. Richard thought he was bringing a victim into our home to humiliate me. He had no idea he was bringing the star witness of his own ruin directly into my office. Evelyn let out a soft, rehearsed whimper, reaching out to touch Richard's hand. The way he looked at her, it wasn't just pity. It was a hungry, desperate kind of devotion. He looked back at me, waiting for me to break, to cry, or to throw a fit so he could justify calling me unstable. Instead, I forced my features into a mask of weary, suburban compliance. I looked at the wheelchair, then at the man I had shared a bed with for 15 years, and I gave him the most dangerous thing a woman like me can offer: a calm, agreeable smile. I told him that if he felt so strongly about his moral obligation, then I wouldn't stand in the way of his conscience. I promised to take excellent care of her. Richard's shoulders relaxed, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought I was finally broken. As they rolled toward the guest wing, I pulled the pen from my pocket and pressed the tiny recessed button. The faint, mechanical click was the most satisfying sound I had heard all year. The audit had officially begun. The audacity of a man bringing another woman into the home his wife paid for? It's a special kind of betrayal, isn't it? If you've ever felt the sting of being taken for granted, hit like and tell me where you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone in this. As the squeak of the wheelchair finally faded into the guest wing, a heavy, suffocating stillness returned to the kitchen. I stood there, my hand still gripping the silver pen, my knuckles white. I looked down at the granite island, honed marble, custom installed just 3 years ago. To Richard, this was just a surface to rest his scotch on. To me, it was a tombstone for 1,000 missed dinners and 10,000 hours of overtime. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I wasn't in a $1 million villa in the hills. I was back in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in San Jose, where the air conditioner groaned like a dying animal, and the scent of cheap takeout permeated the walls. It was 15 years ago. We were young, scrappy, as Richard liked to say. He had the charm, the expensive smile, and the big dreams of becoming a titan in the investment world. But I was the one who stayed up until 2 a.m. under the flicker of a desk lamp, studying for my compliance certifications while he slept. I was the one who packed his lunches in reusable containers so we could save an extra $50 a week to put into an emergency fund he barely knew existed. In those early days, the American dream didn't feel like a slogan. It felt like a marathon. I remember the heat of a California summer when our old Toyota broke down. We couldn't afford the repair and the rent in the same month. Richard wanted to put it on a high-interest credit card to live a little and figure it out later. I was the one who walked 3 miles to the train station in heels, sweating through my blazer, just to ensure our credit score remained pristine. I was the one who calculated the interest rates, the amortization schedules, and the tax implications of every single move we made. Every brick of this house was laid with my discipline. While Richard was out networking at expensive bars, trying to look like the man he hadn't yet become, I was building our fortress. I remember the day we finally moved into this house. Richard carried me over the threshold, whispering about how we had finally made it. I believed him. I thought his ambition was the engine, and my pragmatism was the fuel. I didn't realize then that he wasn't looking for a partner to build a life with. He was looking for a bank that wouldn't charge him interest. The contrast between those memories and the current reality felt like a physical blow to my chest. Richard had spent the last decade growing soft on the luxury I provided. He traded his scrappiness for entitlement. Lately, I had noticed the subtle shifts. The way he suddenly started taking business trips to the Caymans. The way he became defensive about the joint retirement fund I had spent 15 years nourishing like a garden. He started calling my work pedantic. He mocked the very attention to detail that had kept us out of debt, while our neighbors were losing their homes in the 2008 crash. He looked at my spreadsheets and saw boring paperwork, never realizing that those rows of numbers were the only reason he could afford the silk ties he wore to slanders me. And then there was the money. My compliance brain had started flagging irregularities months ago. It started with small withdrawals, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, labeled as consulting fees. But I knew Richard's firm. They didn't pay consultants in cash through offshore intermediaries. I had watched him become increasingly reckless, his eyes darting away whenever I asked about our quarterly projections. He thought I was too dry to notice the scent of desperation on him. He didn't realize that an auditor doesn't need to see the fire to know that something is burning. We just have to follow the smoke. Bringing Evelyn here wasn't just an affair. It was a hostile takeover. He was using the very roof I had paid for to shelter the woman he was using my money to support. He thought that by labeling her a charity case, he could bypass my logic. He played on the idea that I was the cold one, the one who cared more about rules than people. It was a calculated move to make me feel small, to make me feel like my hard work had robbed me of my humanity. I walked over to the window and looked out at the backyard. The roses were in bloom, the ones I had planted myself because the landscaper Richard wanted was too expensive back then. I realized in that moment that Richard hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had betrayed the very essence of the life we had built. He was treating our legacy like a disposable asset, something to be traded in for a newer, shinier, more tragic model. But as I felt the weight of the silver recorder in my pocket, the grief began to harden into something much more useful. If Richard wanted to treat our life like a game of high-stakes poker, he had forgotten one very important rule. You never try to bluff the person who keeps the books. He thought I was a maid in my own home? Fine. I would play the part. I would fetch the water, I would fluff the pillows, and I would be the silent, boring woman he expected. But every time I entered that guest room, I wouldn't just be checking on a paralyzed woman. I would be performing a forensic audit of their lies, one piece of evidence at a time. I leaned against the cold marble of the counter, the same counter I had worked so hard to afford, and felt a strange sense of clarity. The house was paid off. The title was in my name. And by the time I was finished, Richard and his muse would realize that the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one who screams. It's the one who counts every single cent. The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as a series of chores. Richard had transformed our guest suite into a shrine of recovery, filled with expensive flowers and high-tech medical equipment, all of which, I noted with a grim satisfaction, were being billed to our joint credit card. My life, once defined by the orderly rhythm of corporate compliance and the quiet peace of my home, was now dictated by the sharp, persistent ring of a silver bell Evelyn kept on her nightstand. She rang it for everything. A glass of alkaline water at exactly 55 degrees. A specific silk pillow that needed fluffing every hour. The sheer audacity of her presence was like a stain on the hardwood floors I had polished with my own hands. I played the role of the dutiful, boring wife to perfection, moving with a silent, robotic efficiency that seemed to irritate Richard even more than if I had screamed. He wanted me to be jealous. He wanted me to be small. He didn't realize I was simply gathering data. One Tuesday evening, the humiliation reached a fever pitch. I was serving a bowl of organic butternut squash soup, Evelyn's prescribed dinner, when she let out a soft, theatrical gasp. With a flick of her wrist that looked suspiciously coordinated for someone with limited mobility, she tipped the bowl. The orange liquid splattered across my cream-colored cashmere sweater, a gift to myself for my 10-year anniversary at the firm, and pooled onto the rug. Richard was there in an instant, but he didn't reach for me. He grabbed a linen napkin and began frantically dabbing at Evelyn's hand, as if the lukewarm soup were acid. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a cruel, condescending light. He told me that my lack of emotional intelligence was becoming a liability, He said that because I spent my life looking for errors in other people's work, I had forgotten how to be a human being. "Look at her, Andrea," he hissed, gesturing to the woman who was currently wearing a smirk of pure triumph. "She's fragile. She's an artist. You wouldn't understand the toll this takes on a sensitive soul because you don't have one. You're just a machine that prints money and files reports." I stood there, the warm soup seeping through my clothes, feeling the heavy silence of the house pressing against my ears. I didn't defend myself. I didn't point out that the machine he was insulting had paid for the very soup I was now cleaning off the floor. Instead, I looked at Evelyn. She was leaning back, her eyes fluttering with fake exhaustion, but I noticed the way her hand gripped the armrest of the wheelchair. Her knuckles weren't white from pain. They were steady. As a compliance director, I am trained to look for deviations from the norm. A woman who hasn't walked in months should have significant muscle atrophy. Yet Evelyn's calves, though hidden under that expensive wool blanket, didn't look like they belonged to a long-term invalid. I knelt to clean the rug, my face inches from her feet. I saw a tiny, quasi-invisible smudge of dirt on the side of her silk slipper. The kind of smudge you get from walking across a dusty patio, not from sitting in a sanitized suite. I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. It wasn't just an affair. It was a long con. Richard continued his tirade, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the home I had built. He began talking about reallocating assets for Evelyn's long-term care, his tone suggesting that my opinion on the matter was as irrelevant as a typo in a draft. He called my career glorified bookkeeping and suggested that I should be grateful he was giving me something meaningful to do with my time. Every word was a brick in the wall he was building between his new life and our old one. He even had the gall to tell me that Evelyn had forgiven me for my coldness, as if I were the one who had trespassed. I simply nodded, my eyes fixed on the stain on the rug. I told him I would go to the laundry room to find a stronger cleaner. As I turned to leave, I heard Evelyn's soft, melodic laugh, a sound that was meant to be sweet, but sounded like the rattling of a snake. Downstairs, in the sterile white light of the laundry room, I stripped off the ruined sweater. I didn't cry. I didn't have time for the luxury of tears. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my secure banking app. I watched the numbers. Another $5,000 had been moved that afternoon to an account titled EC Wellness Holdings. I tracked the routing number. It led straight to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Richard thought he was being clever, hiding the money under the guise of medical expenses. He thought that because I was dry and obsessed with rules, I wouldn't see the pattern. He was wrong. Rules are not just constraints. They are the lines that show you exactly where someone has stepped out of bounds. I leaned against the washing machine, the vibration of the spin cycle matching the steady, cold beat of my heart. They were turning my home into a theater of the absurd, but they forgot that I was the one who owned the stage. I spent the rest of the night cleaning. To Richard, I was just a woman scrubbing floors to atone for her soullessness. In reality, I was placing 2 more discreet recording devices, one under the vanity in the guest bathroom, and another behind the heavy drapes of the sunroom. My mind was already moving toward the next phase of the audit. If Evelyn was faking her paralysis, she would eventually get tired of the chair. A woman with her ego couldn't stay seated forever, especially not when she thought she had already won the game. I just needed to wait for the moment her miracle occurred. As I climbed into bed, alone, while Richard comforted Evelyn through her night tremors, I felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation didn't hurt anymore because it wasn't personal. It was just more evidence. And in the world of compliance, the only thing that matters is the final report. The following morning, I didn't wake up as a grieving wife. I woke up as a forensic investigator. The California sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our master bedroom, illuminating the empty space where Richard usually slept. He had spent the night in the guest wing, claiming Evelyn needed round-the-clock monitoring for her phantom pain. I didn't mind. His absence was a gift. It gave me the silence I needed to dismantle his life. I sat at my mahogany desk, the one Richard often joked was too big for a woman who just checks boxes, and opened my laptop. To him, I was probably just updating a grocery list or filing a mundane expense report. He had no idea I was logging into a secure VPN, bypassed through a server in Zurich, to begin the deep dive audit of the Perez-Brown joint accounts. The numbers didn't lie, and they certainly didn't have soul to lose. They only had the truth to tell. As I navigated through our retirement portfolios, the ones I had painstakingly curated since my mid-20s, a cold chill settled in my marrow. The leakage was systematic. Over the last 6 months, Richard had been siphoning off chunks of our 401ks, disguised as diversified REIT investments. But when I traced the transaction IDs, they didn't lead to real estate. They flowed into a series of shell companies, Golden State Consulting, Mariposa Holdings, all of which shared a single common denominator, a mailing address that was nothing more than a P.O. box in Grand Cayman. My boring compliance brain instantly flagged the pattern. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated liquidation of our shared future to fund a life I wasn't invited to. While I was deep in the digital trenches, the door to the office creaked open. Richard stood there, draped in a silk robe I had bought him for his birthday, holding a cup of espresso. He looked at my screen, his lip curling in that familiar expression of mockery. He asked me if I ever got tired of staring at dead digits and soulless spreadsheets. He laughed, telling me that while I was busy worrying about decimal points, he and Evelyn were discussing the poetry of the human spirit. He then dropped the bomb. He wanted me to sign a power of attorney document. He claimed that because I was so stressed by my job and the new household responsibilities, he should take over the management of the remaining family trusts to lighten my load. It was a classic move, the final step in stripping me of my autonomy before discarding me. I looked up at him, my expression a perfect imitation of weary, feminine exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the overwhelmed wife to the hilt. I told him I would consider it once I finished my current project, pretending to struggle with a simple pivot table. Richard chuckled, patted my head as if I were a particularly dull child, and walked out, muttering about how some people were simply born to be cogs in the machine. The moment the door closed, my cog heart beat with a ferocious, icy rhythm. I didn't just find the stolen money. I found the trail of his professional suicide. Richard wasn't just stealing from me. He was borrowing from his clients' high-yield portfolios to cover the massive debts he had racked up trying to impress Evelyn. In my world, that's not just a mistake. It's a federal felony. The deeper I dug, the more the miracle of Evelyn's condition began to unravel on paper. I found a digital receipt for a high-end physical therapy clinic in Malibu, dated just 3 weeks ago, billed to Richard's private credit card. The patient's name? Evelyn Chavez. The treatment? Post-surgical athletic recovery. Paralyzed people don't need athletic recovery for their lower extremities. My husband was paying for her to stay in peak physical shape, while they both laughed at me for carrying her trays and washing her linens. It was a play, a meticulously staged drama designed to make me the villain in my own home, while they played the tragic lovers. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I could have confronted him then. I could have screamed and thrown the laptop at his smug, handsome face. But a compliance director knows that a premature disclosure ruins the entire investigation. I needed the receipts to be airtight. I needed him to believe he was inches away from the finish line so he would stop looking behind him. As I closed the lid of my laptop, I felt a strange sense of intellectual satisfaction. Richard thought I was a woman with no soul because I lived by the rules. He was about to find out that when you break the rules in front of an auditor, the only thing they have left for you is a very, very long sentence. The smell of roasting chicken filled the kitchen that evening, a scent of domestic stability that was as fake as Evelyn's spinal injury. I stood at the Marble Island, mindlessly chopping herbs, playing the part of the compliant wife, while Richard sat at the breakfast nook, his eyes glued to his phone, a smug smile playing on his lips. He probably thought I was preoccupied with the dinner menu. In reality, my mind was miles away, navigating the digital labyrinth of the Cayman National Bank. Every time he looked up to toss a casual insult about how predictable and domestic I had become, I simply smiled and offered him a glass of wine. I was seasoning the bird, but I was basting his professional coffin. Earlier that afternoon, while Richard was massaging Evelyn's legs in the sunroom, I had made a breakthrough. Using a secondary encrypted laptop I kept hidden in my gym bag, I had finally cracked the code to his private ledger. It wasn't just a simple affair. It was a sophisticated Ponzi-style embezzlement scheme within his own firm. Richard had been taking loans from the high-yield portfolios of his oldest, most trusting clients, people who had worked their whole lives for a comfortable retirement in Orange County, and funneling that capital through Mariposa Holdings. From there, the money took a scenic route through a series of shell companies before landing in a personal account in the Caymans. The beneficiary? Not Richard, Evelyn Chavez. The technicality of it was breathtakingly sloppy for a man who claimed to be a financial genius. He was using current client deposits to cover the interest payments of previous ones, skimming the surplus to fund Evelyn's lifestyle. He had bought her a condo in Cabo San Lucas, a fleet of luxury skincare products, and was currently paying for a private experimental treatment that cost $20,000 a month. My boring compliance brain did the math in seconds. He had already liquidated nearly 40% of our shared retirement fund to keep his muse happy. Every cent I had saved, every bonus I had rolled over, every sacrifice I had made to ensure we wouldn't be a burden to anyone in our old age, was being spent on silk sheets and designer wheelchairs for a woman who could probably run a marathon. Richard walked over to the counter, leaning in close enough for me to smell Evelyn's expensive floral perfume on his collar. He reached for a piece of chopped rosemary, his tone dripping with a mixture of boredom and condescension. He told me that he was planning a business trip to the Caribbean next month and suggested I take that time to deep clean the house. He said my obsession with order was the only thing I was actually good at, and he wanted the place pristine for when he and Evelyn returned. He actually had the nerve to say that my life was so linear and uninspired that I probably enjoyed the quiet of an empty house. I kept my eyes on the knife, the blade sliding through the herbs with clinical precision. I told him that I would make sure everything was exactly where it belonged by the time he got back. What he didn't realize was that linear people are the most dangerous. We follow the line until it leads to the truth. I had already downloaded the full transaction history of his embezzlement, cross-referenced with the internal compliance logs of his firm. I found the smoking gun, a series of emails where he had forged my digital signature to authorize the transfer of our joint assets. He thought my years of checking boxes meant I was a mindless follower of rules. He forgot that the person who knows the rules best is the only one who knows exactly how to use them as a noose. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man I had built a life with, the man I had trusted to be my partner in the American dream. He looked back with a hollow, arrogant gaze, seeing only a dry auditor who was too dull to understand his grand passion. He had no idea that I wasn't just cooking dinner. I was finalizing a federal report. I was no longer his wife. I was his ultimate auditor. And in my world, there is no such thing as a mercy credit. As I slid the chicken into the oven, I felt a cold, intellectual rush of adrenaline. Richard thought he was playing a game of hearts, but he had accidentally entered a game of numbers. And I was the one who held the ledger. The clock on the microwave glowed a sterile digital green, 2:14 a.m. In the silence of the house, that time felt less like an hour and more like a confession. I hadn't been sleeping. My mind was a ledger that refused to balance, constantly replaying the erratic flow of funds I had discovered earlier. But then, a sound broke the rhythm of my thoughts. It wasn't the familiar, rhythmic squeak of Evelyn's wheelchair, the sound that had become the soundtrack of my humiliation. This was different. It was the faint, rhythmic thump drag of something heavy, followed by the unmistakable, sharp clink of glass against stone. I slipped out of bed, my movements practiced and silent. Years of staying late in corporate offices had taught me how to move through a building without disturbing the air. I didn't turn on the lights. I let the moonlight filtering through the high, clear-story windows guide me toward the kitchen. As I reached the edge of the hallway, I stopped. The refrigerator door was open, casting a long, rectangular slab of light across the hardwood floor. There, standing in the center of the glow, was the miracle. Evelyn wasn't in her wheelchair. She was standing perfectly upright, her back to me, draped in one of my silk robes, the navy one Richard had told me was too professional for the bedroom. She wasn't frail. She wasn't trembling. In fact, she moved with the lithe, predatory grace of a woman who spent more time on a yoga mat than in a hospital bed. I watched, frozen in the shadows, as she reached for the top shelf, the one she had claimed she couldn't even see from her seated perspective, and pulled out a bottle of my vintage Cabernet. She didn't use a corkscrew. She used the electric wine opener I had bought for our last anniversary, handling it with the steady, practiced grip of someone who had done this every night since she arrived. She poured a glass, the dark liquid swirling in the crystal, and then she did something that made my blood run colder than the filtered water in the fridge. She walked. She didn't limp, she didn't stumble. She took 4 long, confident strides over to the kitchen island, the very island where she had accidentally spilled soup on me just days ago. She leaned against the marble, took a long, appreciative sip of the wine, and then picked up my jewelry dish. I watched her slender fingers sift through my things, picking up the diamond studs my father had given me when I passed the bar. She held them up to the light, a small, twisted smirk playing on her lips. She wasn't just stealing my husband or my money. She was auditioning for my life, and she clearly thought she had already landed the role. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady, the professional reflex of a woman who knows when she's found the smoking gun. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen dimmed to the lowest setting. I tapped the camera icon and switched to video. The red recording dot blinked like a tiny, vengeful eye. I captured it all. The paralyzed muse dancing on her toes to a silent rhythm, the way she tossed back the wine, and the moment she picked up a piece of my expensive chocolates, chewed it slowly, and then spat it into the sink with a look of utter disdain. She looked toward the hallway then, and for a second, I thought she saw me. I held my breath, the silence of the house suddenly roaring in my ears. But she just laughed, a low, husky sound that carried no trace of the fragile girl Richard was so desperate to protect. She whispered something to the empty room, a phrase that sounded like, "too easy," before setting the glass down and walking, back toward the guest wing. I heard the soft thump of her sitting back into the wheelchair, followed by the performative, mechanical squeak as she rolled herself the last few inches into the bedroom. I stood in the darkness for a long time after she was gone, the video file saved and backed up to 3 different cloud servers. Richard thought I was soulless because I lived by logic. But logic is a beautiful thing. It doesn't get distracted by a pretty face or a tragic backstory. He was upstairs, probably dreaming of a future built on embezzled funds and a miracle recovery, while his destiny was downstairs drinking my wine and mocking my existence. He had called me a cog in the machine, but he forgot one vital thing about cogs. If you jam one, the entire machine grinds to a halt. I looked at the empty wine glass she had left on the counter, a careless mistake from a woman who thought she was untouchable. I didn't clean it. I didn't move it. I just went back to my office, the glow of the laptop screen now my only company. I had the financial fraud, I had the forgery, and now I had the miracle on tape. The audit wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the complete and total liquidation of their lies. The sun rose over the California hills the next morning with a clarity that felt almost violent. I didn't wash the wine glass Evelyn had left on the counter. Instead, I carefully lifted it using a silk handkerchief and placed it inside a gallon-sized freezer bag, sealing it with a clinical snap. To a normal wife, it was a piece of trash. to a compliance director, it was a forensic treasure trove of DNA and unwashed arrogance. I spent the next 3 hours in my home office, the door locked, finalizing what I internally called the Perez liquidation file. I cross-referenced the video footage of Evelyn's midnight stroll with the billing cycles of the Malibu Recovery Clinic and Richard's offshore wire transfers. The pattern was beautiful in its ugliness, a perfect loop of fraud, embezzlement, and a staggeringly stupid belief that I was too boring to notice. By 10 a.m., I made the call I had been preparing for since the first dollar went missing. Arthur Sterling, the regional director of Richard's firm and my former mentor, answered on the second ring. Arthur was a man of the old school. He believed in the sanctity of the fiduciary duty and the absolute necessity of the American dream being earned, not stolen. When I told him I was calling not as Richard's wife, but as a fellow professional conducting an independent audit, his voice dropped an octave into a tone of grave interest. I didn't lead with the affair. Arthur didn't care about broken hearts. I led with the broken ledgers. I spoke in the language we both spoke best: ERISA violations, commingling of funds, and the systematic bleeding of high-yield portfolios. As I described the shell companies in the Caymans, I could practically hear Arthur's jaw tightening over the line. He promised me a private meeting the following morning at the corporate headquarters. No lawyers, no assistants, just the data. Just as I hung up, Richard pounded on the door. I didn't flinch. I calmly closed my encrypted tabs, tucked the freezer bag into my desk drawer, and opened the door to find him standing there, looking frantic. He didn't ask how I was. He demanded to know why the EC Wellness credit card had been declined at a boutique in Beverly Hills that morning. He had the nerve to look at me with genuine accusation, as if my clerical error was the reason his mistress couldn't buy another designer handbag. He leaned against the doorframe, his voice dripping with that toxic mix of pity and impatience. He told me that my fixation on the budget was suffocating the household, and that Evelyn was stressed because of my negative energy. "You're so obsessed with the rules, Andrea, that you're losing the only thing that makes a woman attractive, her supportiveness," he sneered. He then informed me that he had scheduled a celebratory luncheon at the firm's headquarters in 2 days to mark his expected promotion to senior partner. He told me to wear something less gray and to make sure I brought Evelyn in her chair so the board could see what a compassionate, family-oriented leader he was. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of humor. He was literally inviting me to the scene of his own professional execution and asking me to pick out the outfit. I told him, with a voice as smooth as glass, that I wouldn't miss it for the world. I even promised to wear the red power suit I had bought when I made director, the one he always said made me look too intimidating. He laughed, patted my cheek as if I were a loyal pet, and told me he was glad I was finally getting with the program. He had no idea that the program was a federal investigation. As he walked away to go comfort Evelyn, I returned to my desk. I wasn't just preparing a divorce. I was preparing a total systemic collapse. Richard thought his promotion was a done deal, a crowning achievement for his genius. He didn't realize that in 48 hours, the only thing he'd be leading was a line of defendants in a federal courtroom. I spent the rest of the day in a state of cold, calculated grace. I contacted my own attorney, a woman who specialized in high-asset divorces and white-collar crime, and handed over a mirrored copy of my findings. We drafted the filing, but I gave her one strict instruction: do not serve him until he is standing in that boardroom. I wanted him to feel the height of his perceived success right before the floor vanished beneath his feet. I watched Evelyn through the sunroom window later that afternoon, sitting in her wheelchair, pretending to be exhausted while Richard read her poetry. I wondered if she knew that the silk blanket over her legs was the most expensive thing she'd ever own. or that the man she was destined for was currently a walking ghost. I leaned back in my chair, the compliance file now complete. Richard and Evelyn were about to learn that when you try to steal a woman's legacy, you don't just lose the money, you lose the right to the story. Richard thought he was playing a game of pity, but I've been tracing every cent of his betrayal since the minute they arrived. What would you do if you saw your paralyzed rival dancing in your home? Would you scream, or would you wait for the perfect moment to strike? Let me know by commenting "justice" to support my next move, and don't forget to like this video. The morning of the celebratory luncheon arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. A perfect, sterile California day that masked the rot beneath the surface. I stood before the full-length mirror in our master bedroom, fastening the buttons of my crimson power suit. The wool was sharp, the lines were unforgiving, and the color was the exact shade of a high-priority red flag. Richard had told me to wear something less gray, expecting me to fade into the background like a dusty piece of office furniture. Instead, I looked like the person who was about to set his world on fire. I leaned in, applying a layer of lipstick with the precision of an architect. I wasn't just dressing for a party, I was dressing for a deposition. Downstairs, the atmosphere was thick with Richard's performative heroism. He was carefully adjusting the silk blanket over Evelyn's legs, whispering sweet encouragements about how brave she was to go out in public. Evelyn was draped in a cream-colored knit dress that screamed, "Innocent victim," her face powdered to look pale and sickly. When Richard saw me, his eyes narrowed. He didn't compliment the suit. He didn't even acknowledge the mortgage-free home he was standing in. He just checked his gold watch, the one he'd bought with the first loan from our joint account, and told me to hurry up. "You look intense, Andrea," he said, his voice dripping with distaste. "Try to smile more. This is the biggest day of my career. Don't let your compliance face ruin the mood for the board." The drive to the corporate headquarters in downtown Los Angeles was a study in psychological dissonance. Richard drove his silver Porsche, another gift to himself, while Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, sighing dramatically at every bump in the road. I sat in the back, silent and still, looking like a high-end chauffeur for two people who were currently stealing my life. Richard spent the 30-minute drive lecturing me on the optics of the afternoon. He told me that his promotion to senior partner was a win for us, even though he had spent the last 6 months making sure there was no us left in our bank accounts. He spoke about his vision for the firm, about disrupting the market, and about how Evelyn's spirit had inspired him to take bigger risks. Every time he used the word risk, I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. He had no idea that his risks had already been quantified, indexed, and filed in a secure folder in Arthur Sterling's desk. When we arrived at the sleek, glass and steel tower of Sterling and Associates, Richard's ego seemed to physically expand. He insisted on pushing Evelyn's wheelchair himself, moving through the lobby with a somber, noble expression that invited pity from every passerby. "The devoted husband," I heard a junior analyst whisper. What a saint. I followed 3 paces behind, my heels clicking against the polished marble with a rhythmic, lethal cadence. Click, click, click. The sound of a countdown. I watched Evelyn play her part to perfection, fluttering her eyelashes and nodding weakly at the receptionists. She was the muse, the tragedy, the reason for Richard's newfound drive. To the rest of the world, she was a miracle of survival. To me, she was a woman who drank my wine and spat out my chocolates at 2 a.m. The luncheon was held in the executive dining room on the 42nd floor, overlooking the sprawling chaos of the city. The room was filled with the heavyweights of the California financial world, men in $10,000 suits, and women who had spent decades building their empires. Richard thrived in this environment. He moved from table to table, Evelyn in tow, milking the sympathy of the board members. He told stories of their struggle, of how Evelyn's accident had taught him the true meaning of legacy. He even had the audacity to gesture toward me and say, "And of course, my wife Andrea, the backbone of our household. She keeps the books while I chase the dreams." The table erupted in polite, patronizing laughter. They saw me as the boring accountant, the stabilizer for the genius husband. I sat at the head table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I didn't eat the poached salmon. I didn't drink the chilled Chardonnay. I just watched. I watched the way Richard's hand trembled slightly when Arthur Sterling entered the room. I watched the way Evelyn's paralyzed feet shifted almost imperceptibly under her blanket when she thought no one was looking. Richard leaned in and whispered to me, "See? They love us. By the end of this hour, I'll have the keys to the kingdom. Try to look a little less like you're counting the forks, okay?" I looked him directly in the eye, my expression as unreadable as a redacted file. I told him that I was simply making sure everything was in its proper place. The room grew quiet as Arthur Sterling walked toward the podium. Richard stood up, straightening his tie, a look of triumphant arrogance fixed on his face. He reached down to squeeze Evelyn's hand, a final gesture of compassion before his big moment. He thought he was about to be crowned. He thought the American dream he had stolen was finally his. I felt the weight of the silver recorder in my pocket and the hard copy of the federal audit in my bag. The boring wife was finished with the prep work. The compliance director was ready to take the floor. As Arthur looked toward our table, his face a mask of grim professional duty, I felt a surge of cold, white-hot power. Richard wanted a show? Fine. I was about to give him a finale he would never forget. Arthur Sterling didn't look like a man about to hand out a trophy. He looked like a man about to perform an autopsy. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his gaze bypassing Richard entirely and landing directly on me. Richard, completely oblivious to the sudden drop in the room's oxygen, took a half step forward, his chest puffed out, a smug, practiced smile fixed on his face. He was already leaning into the microphone, ready to deliver a pre-written speech about visionary leadership and the poetry of finance. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent dining room like a gavel. "Before we discuss the senior partnership," Arthur began, his voice cold and resonant, "we have a more pressing matter regarding the integrity of this firm. I've invited a specialist to present a very specific internal review. Andrea, if you would please." The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Richard's face went through a fascinating, kaleidoscopic transformation. Confusion, then annoyance, and finally, a flicker of something that looked like primitive animal fear. He hissed at me under his breath. "Andrea, what are you doing? Sit down. You're embarrassing me." I didn't look at him. I stood up, the crimson fabric of my suit catching the light like a warning flare. I didn't walk to the podium like a wife. I walked like a predator. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of folders, thick, heavy, and filled with the kind of boring paperwork Richard had mocked for years. I didn't need a teleprompter. I had lived in these numbers for weeks. I began with the Mariposa Holdings Shell Company. I spoke with a clinical, detached precision, laying out the trail of breadcrumbs that led from the high-yield portfolios of the firm's most loyal clients directly to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I detailed the systematic liquidation of our own joint retirement fund, cross-referencing the dates with business trips Richard had taken to Cabo. "Richard Perez didn't just manage portfolios," I said, my voice steady and echoing against the floor-to-ceiling glass. "He managed a theft. He treated the life savings of our clients as his personal slush fund to finance a lifestyle he couldn't afford and a mistress he couldn't hide. He forged my digital signature on 3 separate occasions to bypass internal controls, believing that my obsessive attention to detail would never be turned toward his own ledger." Richard erupted. He slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a mottled, ugly purple. "This is a lie. She's hysterical. She's a bitter wife trying to sabotage my career because she's jealous of a woman with a real soul. He turned to the board, his voice cracking with desperation. Arthur, you know me. My wife is a compliance director. She's obsessed with rules. She's making this up out of spite. Arthur didn't even look at him. He was staring at the projected screen behind me, where I had uploaded the ledger of the Cayman transfers. The numbers don't have feelings, Richard, Arthur said quietly, and they don't lie. I turned to look at my husband, the man who had called me dry and soulless. He was shrinking. The silver Porsche, the silk ties, the gold watch, they were all falling away, leaving behind nothing but a small, terrified man who had gambled everything on the idea that a woman's intelligence was a negligible variable. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. You wanted me to be your maid, Richard. You wanted me to clean up your mess. Well, I've cleaned it. The audit is finished, and you're in total deficit. The board of directors sat in stunned silence. These were people who valued one thing above all else: trust. And Richard had shattered it in front of their eyes. Two men from the firm's security detail stepped into the room, standing silently by the doors. Richard looked around, his eyes wild, searching for an exit, for a lie, for anything to cling to. He looked at Evelyn, who was sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes wide with a very real, very unscripted terror. She wasn't a muse anymore. She was collateral damage. The federal authorities have already been notified, I continued, closing my folder with a final, satisfying thump. Your credentials have been revoked, your accounts frozen, and your promotion has been replaced by a formal termination for cause. Richard slumped back into his chair, the arrogance finally drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been playing checkers while I was playing a high-stakes game of forensic accounting. He thought he had stolen my legacy. He didn't realize that my legacy wasn't the house, or the money, or the marriage. My legacy was the truth. And the truth had just walked in and taken the keys to the kingdom. Richard sat trembling in his seat, the silence of the room pressing in on him like the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He looked around at the board of directors, men who had been his mentors, women who had been his peers, and saw nothing but a wall of cold, professional disgust. He was a cornered animal, gasping for air, looking for one last branch to grab onto before he plunged into the abyss. He looked at Evelyn, who was sitting in her wheelchair, her face a mask of fragile, tearful shock. Fine, Richard suddenly erupted, his voice cracking with a desperate, manic energy. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a screech of metal against stone. Take the job. Take the money. You always cared more about the numbers than the people anyway, Andrea. You're a machine. But you can't take this. He gestured wildly at Evelyn, his hand shaking. You can't take the fact that I am a man of character. I didn't leave her when the world broke her. I chose love over your cold, calculated ledgers. Go ahead. File your reports. I'll be the one sleeping with a clear conscience, caring for a woman who actually knows how to feel. A few people in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Even in his ruin, Richard was a salesman, trying to sell one last lie, the myth of his own nobility. He thought that if he couldn't be a titan of finance, he would at least be a martyr of the heart. I didn't blink. I didn't even look at him. I simply reached over to the laptop connected to the room's massive 4K display. Character, Richard? That's an interesting choice of words, I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a scalpel. But in my line of work, we don't rely on testimonials. We rely on independent verification. I tapped the trackpad. The screen flickered, and suddenly, the sterile corporate dining room was replaced by the warm amber glow of my own kitchen at 2:14 a.m. The resolution was so sharp you could see the bubbles in the wine glass. The room gasped. On the screen, the fragile Evelyn Chavez wasn't sitting in a chair. She was standing in the center of the frame, draped in my navy silk robe, looking vibrant and entirely mobile. The video played in absolute, harrowing silence. We watched as Evelyn reached for the top shelf with a graceful stretch of her arms. We watched her take several long, confident strides across the hardwood. The very hardwood Richard had claimed she would never walk on again. We watched her drink the vintage Cabernet, mock my jewelry, and spit into the sink. And then, the audio picked up her voice, sharp, husky, and dripping with venom. "Too easy," she whispered on the recording, laughing as she performed a playful little pirouette before heading back to the guest wing. The silence that followed was louder than Richard's screaming. Evelyn, still sitting in the wheelchair in the middle of the dining room, looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Her sickly paleness had turned into a frantic, mottled gray. She wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at the security guards by the door. Richard, meanwhile, looked like he had been struck by lightning. He turned his head slowly, his neck creaking, to look at the woman he had spent our life savings to protect. "Evelyn?" he whispered, the words sounding like a death rattle. She didn't answer him. The muse was gone. In her place was a con artist who realized the stage lights had just been turned on. I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of the wheelchair. I leaned down, my face inches from hers, and for the first time in weeks, I let a genuine smile touch my lips. A cold, sharp thing that didn't reach my eyes. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" I said, my voice amplified by the room's acoustics. "All that boring auditing money paid for a recovery so complete, you can even dance in the dark. But here's the thing about a miracle, Evelyn. It usually doesn't involve a fraud investigation." Arthur Sterling stood up, his face set in a grim mask of authority. "This is no longer just an internal matter of embezzlement. This is a coordinated scheme to defraud a spouse and the firm. Security, please escort Mr. Perez and Ms. Chavez to the lobby. The LAPD and the SEC are waiting downstairs. Richard, don't bother going back to the house. The locks were changed an hour ago, and a restraining order has been filed. Your personal belongings will be sent to the county jail." Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at me, the dry, soulless woman he thought he could discard like an old spreadsheet. He saw the crimson suit, the steady hands, and the legacy he had tried to steal, now fortified and untouchable. He reached out to touch my arm, a last, pathetic attempt at a plea, but I stepped back. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel hurt. I felt the immense, cooling relief of a job well done. As security stepped forward to lift Evelyn out of the chair, knowing now that she didn't need the wheels, she finally snapped. She stood up, her paralyzed legs working perfectly as she tried to shove past the guards, screaming curses at Richard for being too stupid to hide the trail. Richard just watched her run, his world ending not with a bang, but with the sound of his destiny blaming him for their failure. I turned back to the board, adjusted my blazer, and gave a slight professional nod. "The audit of Richard Perez is officially closed," I said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a home to reclaim." The drive back from the headquarters was the most peaceful 30 minutes of my life. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched out before me, the golden hour light turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered copper. I rolled down the windows of my SUV, the one I had paid for in cash, and let the salt air wash away the lingering scent of Richard's cologne and Evelyn's floral perfume. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my ranch-style home, the police had already come and gone. The celebratory Porsche was gone, towed as part of the asset freeze. The guest suite was empty, the high-tech wheelchair left behind like a discarded prop from a bad play. I walked through the front door and was greeted by something I hadn't felt in months: absolute, unadulterated stillness. I didn't rush to clean. I didn't pull out my laptop. I simply walked to the kitchen, the heart of the home I had built, and looked at the mortgage-free title sitting on the counter. I realized then that Richard had been right about one thing. I was a woman of numbers. But what he failed to understand was that numbers aren't just cold digits on a screen. They are the record of a person's choices. My numbers told a story of discipline, of 20 years of waking up early and staying late, of choosing long-term stability over short-term thrills. His numbers told a story of greed, of shortcuts, and of a fundamental disrespect for the life we had shared. I began to walk through each room, reclaiming the space. I opened the heavy drapes in the sunroom, letting the California sun bleach away the memory of Evelyn's fake frailty. I stood in the guest wing, looking at the silk blankets and the expensive medical equipment that had been bought with my sweat and Richard's lies. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the immense, cooling relief of a job well done. The audit was complete. The discrepancies had been resolved. The bad debt had been written off. I was no longer a wife under siege. I was a woman in possession of her own life. I spent the evening packing the last of Richard's things: the silk ties, the gold leaf frames, the trophies he had won for excellence in a career built on theft. I didn't throw them out. I boxed them up neatly and labeled them for the authorities to collect. An auditor respects the process, even when the person she's auditing doesn't. As I worked, I thought about the American dream we used to talk about. Richard thought the dream was about the Porsche and the prestige. I knew the dream was actually about the freedom to look in the mirror and know that everything you own was earned with integrity. I walked out to the back patio as the stars began to poke through the twilight. The air was cool, and the crickets were starting their nightly chorus. I sat in the chair where Richard used to sit and brag about his visionary moves, and I realized that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. I thought about the clients Richard had defrauded, the teachers, the retirees, the families who had trusted him. I had spent the afternoon working with Arthur Sterling to ensure that every single one of them would be made whole from the recovery of Richard's offshore accounts. That was my real bonus. That was the legacy I chose to protect. In the end, Richard lost his job, his reputation, and his freedom, while Evelyn's miracle cure ended with a set of handcuffs. I kept the house, the dignity, and a future I built with my own hands. I realized that my value was never defined by how supportive I was of a lie, but by how unflinching I was in the face of the truth. I looked out at the hills, the lights of Los Angeles twinkling like diamonds in the distance, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel the need to balance a ledger. I was already whole. The quiet of the house was no longer a burden. It was a reward. I went back inside, made myself a simple cup of tea, and sat at the mahogany desk. I wasn't checking bank statements. I wasn't tracking embezzled funds. I was simply staring at a blank piece of paper, ready to write the first chapter of a story that belonged entirely to me. Richard thought I was boring because I followed the rules. He didn't realize that the rules are what keep you standing when the world tries to push you down. And I was still standing. In the end, Richard lost his job, his reputation, and his freedom, while Evelyn's miracle cure ended with a set of handcuffs. I kept the house, the dignity, and a future I built with my own hands. Life has a way of auditing us all, doesn't it? What's your take on how I handled it? Should I have been even tougher? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for walking this path with me.